"Your remedies have killed a patient," the Duke of Blackmere declared before the hospital governors. "My wife is forbidden to practice medicine from this hour." The words struck the council chamber with the force of a judge's hammer. Margaret stood at the end of the long oak table, still wearing the plain gray gown and white apron she used on the wards. There was dried blood on one cuff from tending the patient they now claimed she had murdered. Around her sat 12 governors of St. Agatha's Hospital, landowners, clergymen, and physicians who had praised her work for 6 years. Not one met her eyes. At Edmund's right hand sat his widowed sister, Lady Caroline Vane, dressed in mourning silk, too lustrous to suggest much grief. Before her lay a newly prepared appointment document. Margaret looked back at her husband. "Mr. Samuel Pike was recovering when I left him last night." "He died shortly after midnight," Edmund replied. "Then allow me to examine his body." "There will be no examination." A murmur moved around the table. Margaret's fingers tightened around the small brown medicine bottle she had taken from Pike's bedside. She lifted it toward the window. Dark crystals clung to the bottom of the glass, catching the pale morning light. "This is not my fever tonic. My preparation contains willow bark, elderflower, and diluted tincture of cinchona. It leaves an amber residue. These crystals are nearly black." Sir Alistair Crowe, the physician Edmund had recently appointed to advise the estate, leaned back in his chair. His narrow face remained perfectly composed. "Heat can alter certain compounds," he said. "So can poison." The room fell silent. Edmund's jaw hardened. "Be very careful, Margaret." "I am being careful. That is precisely why I will not permit anyone to bury Samuel Pike before I determine what entered his blood. You no longer possess that authority." Caroline slid the appointment document across the table. Edmund's signature was already drying beneath the Blackmere seal. Margaret read only the first lines before understanding what he had done. Her authority over St. Agatha's was terminated immediately. Its wards, accounts, staff, and dispensary would now be controlled by Lady Caroline. For 6 years, Margaret had converted a crumbling almshouse into the only hospital within 30 miles. She had sold 2 pieces of her mother's jewelry to purchase its first instruments. She had treated miners when fever swept through the northern cottages and remained beside their children when even the parish officers refused to enter. Now, Edmund had transferred it with a signature. "Caroline has secured patrons willing to relieve the estate of this institution's expenses," he said. "Blackmere cannot continue financing your experiments. They are not experiments. Last winter, the hospital treated 412 people, most of whom paid nothing," Caroline observed. "They had nothing. That is hardly the estate's fault." Margaret turned to Edmund. Once, he had carried roof tiles beside the laborers because she had wanted the first ward open before winter. He had stood in the empty chapel and promised that no one under his protection would be denied care. That man was nowhere in his expression now. "If you believed I had mismanaged the hospital," Margaret said quietly, "you could have examined my accounts. If you believed my medicine killed Mr. Pike, you could permit an inquiry. Instead, you have chosen a verdict before asking a single question. I have chosen to protect this family. No, you have chosen the answer that costs you the least." Color rose beneath his cheekbones. For one fleeting instant, Margaret thought he might reconsider. His gaze dropped to the bottle, and uncertainty disturbed the anger in his face. Then Caroline placed 2 fingers on his sleeve. Edmund looked away. "Seal the laboratory," he ordered. "Lady Caroline will assume control before noon." 2 footmen approached Margaret, though neither appeared willing to touch her. She placed the bottle in her apron pocket before Caroline could demand it. "You will surrender that as hospital property," Caroline said. "It may be evidence in a murder. It is evidence of your incompetence." Margaret stepped toward her sister-in-law. "If you destroy it, Caroline, you will prove that one of us is afraid of what it contains." Edmund rose so abruptly that his chair struck the wall. "Enough. Go home, Margaret. Samuel Pike deserves the truth, and I will not allow your pride to drag our name through a public scandal." The injustice of it was almost cleaner than heartbreak. Edmund knew her. He knew how carefully she recorded every dosage, how often she tested a preparation on herself before giving it to a patient. Yet when forced to choose between her word and the convenience of silence, he had not hesitated long enough even to inspect the glass. Margaret removed the hospital keys from her belt and laid them on the table. Caroline smiled, but as Margaret passed Edmund, she said, "If another patient is harmed, the scandal you fear will become the smallest consequence of what you signed today." That night, Margaret did not sleep. Shortly before 2 in the morning, someone knocked against her bedroom window. A young nurse stood below in the garden, her cap missing and her face white with terror. Margaret admitted her through the servants' entrance. "Nurse Bell, what happened?" "The mortuary," the girl gasped. "Mr. Pike's body is gone." Margaret felt the corridor tilt beneath her feet. "Gone where?" "No one knows." Dr. Crow dismissed the attendants, and afterward a covered cart left through the eastern gate. Then we discovered 2 more beds empty in the fever ward. "Discharged?" "The register says so, but their boots and coats are still beneath their beds." Nurse Bell drew a stained admission card from inside her bodice. "I found this beside Dr. Crow's desk." A broad streak of blood crossed the card. Beneath it, someone had written a name and tomorrow's date in black ink. Margaret read the entry once, unable to breathe. Margaret Vane, Duchess of Blackmere. A violent crash sounded from the courtyard. Through the window, Margaret saw flames rising from the direction of St. Agatha's Hospital, and inside her apron pocket, Samuel Pike's medicine bottle was suddenly gone. Margaret ran into the courtyard without stopping for a cloak. The eastern sky glowed orange above the hospital roof. Flames climbed from the rear wing, where the dispensary and laboratory stood. Servants poured from the manor carrying buckets, but St. Agatha's was nearly half a mile away. By the time the estate pumps arrived, every record in Margaret's laboratory could be ash. "Wake the stableman," she ordered. "Bring wet blankets and every ladder you can find." Behind her, Nurse Bell remained frozen in the doorway. Margaret turned back. "Who entered my room while you were there?" "No one, Your Grace. The medicine bottle is missing." The nurse's face emptied of color. Her hand moved instinctively toward her skirt pocket. Margaret seized her wrist. "What have you taken?" "Nothing. Show me." A man shouted near the stables, and several horses reared as bells began ringing across the estate. Nurse Bell twisted free and fled into the dark garden. Margaret started after her, but Edmund appeared at the courtyard entrance, pulling on his coat. "What has happened?" "The laboratory is burning." His eyes moved from the flames to the open servant's door. "Why are you dressed like that?" "Who were you speaking to?" "One of the nurses. She brought news that Samuel Pike's body has disappeared." Edmund stared at her. "That is impossible. So was his death, according to the condition in which I left him." A carriage rolled around the fountain. Sir Alistair Crowe stepped down before it had fully stopped. He wore a dark coat over his nightshirt, yet his silver-tipped cane and polished boots made him appear suspiciously prepared. "The dispensary caught fire," he announced. "The night porter believes a lamp overturned." "Why did you dismiss the mortuary attendants?" Margaret demanded. Crow's gaze settled on her bare feet. "I beg your pardon?" Samuel Pike's body is gone. I authorized his removal to prevent contagion. Where was he taken? To the parish burial house. Then why did the cart leave through the eastern gate? The burial house lies west. Crow hesitated for less than a second. The driver must have taken the river road. Edmund stepped between them. This is neither the time nor place for an interrogation. The fire is destroying the records that could identify what killed Pike, Margaret said, and Crow arrived before the alarm reached the manor. I saw the flames from my lodgings, Crow replied smoothly. Margaret looked toward the physician's cottage. A thick line of ancient yews blocked every view of the hospital. Edmund followed her gaze. He saw it too. For an instant, doubt returned to his face. Then a burning window shattered, sending sparks into the night, and he turned toward the men gathering near the carriage. Contain the fire. Questions can wait. Margaret caught his arm. They have already waited too long. He pulled free. Stay here. St. Agatha's belonged to Caroline now, yet Edmund still expected Margaret to obey while it burned. She climbed onto the back of the departing supply wagon. When the horses reached the hospital, smoke rolled across the courtyard in suffocating waves. The fire had started inside the laboratory, but the stone walls prevented it from spreading rapidly. That should have been a mercy. Instead, Margaret immediately understood its purpose. Only the laboratory had been targeted. She wrapped a wet cloth over her mouth and entered through the chapel passage before anyone could stop her. Heat pressed against her skin. Above the roar of flames, she heard iron striking stone. Someone was inside. Margaret moved along the corridor, keeping low beneath the smoke. At the rear stairwell, she saw a shadow dragging a wooden crate away from the burning laboratory. Stop! The figure released the crate and ran down the servants' stairs. Margaret followed as far as the landing, but a length of burning timber crashed between them. Through the sparks, she glimpsed a blue silk waistcoat beneath the stranger's coat. The same unusual blue Sir Alistair Crow had worn at the governor's meeting. The figure disappeared into the basement. Margaret knelt beside the abandoned crate. Its outer panel was stamped with the hospital's laundry mark, but a sharp metallic odor rose from the damaged corner. She pried at the lid until a nail tore her palm. Inside were dozens of glass vials nestled in straw. None bore proper labels, only numbers and dates. The first vial contained the same black crystals she had seen in Pike's medicine bottle. A hand closed around her shoulder. Margaret spun around, raising the vial as a weapon. Edmund stood behind her, coughing through the smoke. I told you to remain at the manor, and if I had, this would be gone. She showed him the crate. For once, he had no immediate answer. Crow stored these beneath my laboratory, she said. He poisoned Pike, removed his body, and set the fire to conceal it. You saw him? I saw his waistcoat. That is not proof of identity, no, but this may be proof of murder. Edmund examined the black substance through the glass. The certainty in his expression finally faltered. Footsteps approached from the corridor. Crow appeared with two attendants carrying wet blankets. His gaze fell upon the open crate. Your Grace, he said to Edmund, you must move away from those medicines. They are highly dangerous. You know what they are? Margaret asked. Crow's lips tightened. Before he could answer, Lady Caroline entered behind him, dressed in an ivory traveling cloak. She showed no surprise at the contents of the crate. That belongs to the crown, she said. Edmund turned sharply. What does that mean? Caroline looked at Margaret rather than her brother. It means your wife has broken into a restricted laboratory and stolen materials used for confidential military research. Margaret almost laughed at the audacity of it. This is my laboratory, not since yesterday morning. Caroline produced a folded document bearing a government seal. It authorized Crowe to conduct medical research at St. Agatha's under Edmund's protection. His signature appeared at the bottom. Margaret watched her husband read the paper he had evidently signed without understanding. The consequences of his choice were no longer theoretical. Crowe had gained access to the hospital because Edmund had granted it. A scream rose from somewhere below them. Not a cry of pain, a desperate human scream, cut short as though a hand had covered the victim's mouth. Margaret grabbed a lantern and hurried toward the basement stairs. Edmund followed, but Caroline blocked his path. "If you go down there," she warned her brother, "you will destroy everything our family has worked to secure." Edmund stared at her. Margaret continued alone. At the bottom of the stairs, she found a locked door that had not existed when she managed the hospital. Behind it came the scrape of wheels and a weak, familiar voice. "Your Grace?" It was Samuel Pike, the patient everyone claimed was dead. Margaret reached for the handle. A cloth clamped over her mouth from behind, filling her lungs with a sickly, sweet vapor. The lantern slipped from her fingers as the darkness swallowed her. Margaret awoke to the rhythm of wheels beneath her body. Her wrists had been tied behind her, and a coarse sack covered her head. Each breath carried the lingering sweetness of the chemical pressed over her mouth. She forced herself not to move. Two men sat somewhere near her in the enclosed carriage. "Crowe said she would remain unconscious until the river," one muttered, "and if she wakes, use the second cloth." Margaret slowed her breathing. Her cheek rested against cold wood, but something soft lay beneath her fingers. She traced it carefully, a folded woolen blanket marked with the raised embroidery used by St. Agatha's laundry. This was the same carriage that had removed the missing patients. She counted the turns. Right at the hospital gate, a long descent over uneven ground. Left where the wheels struck a row of loose stones. They were traveling toward the old dye works beside the river, a factory abandoned after its owner's bankruptcy. Margaret tested the rope around her wrists. The knot was tight, but her fingers found a small metal clasp in the blanket's hem. One of the laundry women had repaired it with a bent fastening hook. She worked the hook against the rope strand by strand. The men spoke again. "Will the Duke search for her?" Lady Caroline said he believes his wife started the fire after stealing government medicines. And the patients? They go aboard at dawn. The river route led directly to the coast. Margaret's hands came free as the carriage slowed. She kept them behind her back. A door opened and someone dragged her out by the shoulders. Damp air touched her feet. She heard water flowing nearby and smelled coal smoke mixed with chemicals. "Put her with the others." The men carried her through a building and dropped her onto a narrow bed. A lock turned after they left. Margaret removed the sack. 12 beds filled the long brick room. Men, women, and children lay beneath gray blankets, most unconscious. Their faces were pale, their hands trembling even in sleep. Beside each bed stood a card bearing a number instead of a name. Samuel Pike occupied the nearest cot. His eyes opened when Margaret touched his shoulder. "Your Grace," he whispered. "They said I was dead." "Keep your voice down. What did they give you?" Dr. Crowe called it a fever medicine. "It burned through my arm." Margaret examined the puncture near his elbow. A dark line spread beneath the skin. Crowe had not poisoned these people merely to kill them. He was observing how their bodies reacted. "Did you hear where they intend to take you?" "A ship. They said soldiers would pay for the ones who survived." A child whimpered across the room. Margaret recognized 7-year-old Thomas Reed, admitted to St. Agatha's after collapsing near the mine. She crossed to him and found his pulse racing dangerously. Beside his bed was a syringe containing a cloudy, black solution. She smelled it, but did not dare taste it. The metallic odor suggested antimony, combined with another agent she could not identify. Administered repeatedly, it would cause vomiting, tremors, delirium, and eventually heart failure. Every patient in the room was poor. Few had relatives powerful enough to demand an investigation. Their recorded deaths had turned them into human cargo. Footsteps sounded outside. Margaret slipped the syringe beneath her torn apron and returned to her bed. The door opened, and Crow entered with a broad-shouldered guard. The physician regarded her calmly. "I expected you to wake sooner. You murdered people under my roof. Your patients are alive, some of them. How many did not survive?" Crow removed his gloves one finger at a time. "Progress has always required sacrifice. Then begin with yourself." His smile disappeared. "You disappoint me, Duchess. Your formulas showed genuine promise. I tried to persuade Caroline that you could be useful, but she considers you impossible to control. Why are these people being taken to a ship? That does not concern you. It will concern every magistrate in England when I testify." Crow glanced at the numbered card attached to her bed. "The Duchess of Blackmere will not testify. By noon, her grieving husband will be informed that she died after inhaling smoke while destroying evidence of her crimes." Margaret's stomach tightened, but she refused to show fear. Edmund heard Samuel's voice. "Did he?" Lady Caroline was remarkably effective at keeping him upstairs. "You are relying on my husband's blindness." "No, Your Grace. I am relying on his ambition." Crow leaned closer. "Your husband wants a position in the government. Caroline promised him one through the men financing this research. He signed every authorization we required because he wanted the reward more than he wanted explanations." The words wounded, because they matched what Margaret had already witnessed. And what did Caroline want? Freedom from the debts left by her late husband. This arrangement provides it. Crow motioned to the guard. "Prepare the patients. The barge arrives within the hour." When they left, Margaret retrieved the syringe. Samuel watched her. "Can you save us? I can keep some of you alive, but we must prevent that barge from leaving." At the rear of the room, a narrow drainage channel ran beneath the brick wall. It was too small for an adult, but Thomas might fit through once he regained consciousness. Margaret searched the shelves and found salt, charcoal, vinegar, and a jar of powdered mustard. Crude tools, but sufficient to induce vomiting and reduce further absorption in those recently dosed. She began with Thomas. As the boy slowly opened his eyes, Margaret placed the fastening hook in his hand and explained how to crawl through the channel. He would follow it to the riverbank, then run uphill until he reached the parish road. "Find the Duke of Blackmere," she whispered. "Tell him Samuel Pike lives. Tell him Caroline has 12 patients at the dye works." Thomas looked terrified. "What if he doesn't believe me?" Margaret hesitated. Edmund had ignored a poison bottle, signed away her hospital, and refused to question the people exploiting his authority. She could no longer stake their lives on his trust. "Then find Magistrate Harcourt," she said. "Give him this." She tore the numbered card from her bed and wrapped it around the syringe. Thomas disappeared into the drain. Minutes later, bells rang outside. The barge had arrived. Guards entered and began lifting the unconscious patients onto stretchers. Margaret resisted until one pressed a pistol against Samuel's temple. She allowed them to bind her again. Outside, dawn spread over the river. A long black barge waited beside the landing, its deck crowded with sealed crates. Caroline stood near the gangplank, supervising the transfer. Edmund was nowhere in sight. Margaret was pushed toward the vessel. As she reached the plank, a small figure emerged from the reeds on the opposite bank. Thomas had not escaped. A man in a dark riding coat held him by the collar. The man raised his head, and Margaret recognized Edmund. In his other hand, he held the syringe and her numbered card. Caroline smiled as her brother crossed the bridge toward them. "Thank heaven you found the boy," she called. Margaret tried to poison him. Edmund stopped before his wife. For one unbearable moment, his expression revealed nothing. Then he drew his pistol and aimed it directly at Margaret's heart. The shot cracked across the river. Margaret did not feel the bullet strike. Instead, the guard behind her released a strangled cry and collapsed against the gangplank. His pistol skidded across the stones. Edmund had aimed past her shoulder. "Get away from my wife," he said. For one stunned second, no one moved. Then Crow shouted, "Seize the Duke!" Two armed men rushed from the barge. Edmund pushed Thomas behind a stack of timber and fired again, forcing them to take cover. Margaret tore free from the guard's loosened grasp and dragged Samuel toward the bridge. Caroline stepped into her path. "You have no idea what you are destroying," she hissed. "I know exactly what you built." Caroline slapped her. Margaret's head snapped sideways. Pain flashed across her cheek, but she did not retreat. She caught Caroline's wrist before the second blow and twisted until her sister-in-law gasped. "You took sick people from their beds," Margaret said. "You erased their names and sold their suffering. Never touch me again." She shoved Caroline away and reached Samuel as Crow seized the weakened man from behind. The physician pressed a knife against his throat. "Put down the pistol, Blackmere," Crow ordered, "or your dead patient will become one." Edmund hesitated. The barge crew emerged with muskets, spreading along the deck. They outnumbered him 6-1. Behind Margaret, the remaining patients were being carried aboard, too drugged to resist. "Let Pike go," Edmund said. "I signed the authorization. If you need someone to answer for this, take me." Caroline stared at him. "Do not be absurd. You were promised a place in the War Office. By whom? Men whose names you are not entitled to know. And I trusted you. You wanted power. I merely showed you where to sign." The truth landed visibly. Edmund's ambition had opened St. Agatha's to Crow, but Caroline had relied on his willingness not to ask questions. His face tightened with shame. Crow pulled Samuel closer to the gangplank. "The pistol, Your Grace." Margaret saw Thomas crawling toward the discarded weapon near the fallen guard. She shook her head slightly. The boy stopped. If he reached for it, Crow's men would kill him. Margaret turned toward the river. The barge was held beside the landing by two thick ropes. Steam hissed from a small engine mounted at its stern, while sealed chemical crates crowded the deck. Above them swung an iron loading hook suspended from the dye works' old pulley system. The rope controlling it ran through a wheel beside the warehouse door. Margaret looked at Edmund. Years earlier, during the hospital's construction, they had developed a silent signal for directing laborers across noisy rooms. 2 fingers meant wait, a closed fist meant pull. She raised 2 fingers against her skirt. His gaze dropped briefly to her hand. Crow mistook the movement for trembling. "Your wife has finally understood her position." Margaret stepped toward him. "You require someone who can monitor the patients during transport. Half of them will die before reaching the coast unless their doses are adjusted. You expect me to believe you would help? I expect you to understand that dead subjects are worthless." Crow studied her. Greed weakened his caution. "What do you want?" "The child remains here. Samuel too." "No. Then you may explain to your financiers why 12 bodies arrived instead of 12 living trials." Caroline approached Crow and lowered her voice. "Take her." Once aboard, she cannot escape. Crow finally released Samuel and pushed him toward Edmund. "Bring the Duchess." As a guard seized Margaret's arm, she closed her fist. Edmund lunged for the pulley rope. The iron hook swung across the landing and smashed into the stack of crates. Wood shattered. Glass burst beneath the impact, spilling black liquid across the deck. Crow shouted for the crew to move the barge. The engine roared. One mooring rope snapped free, but the second remained tied. The vessel twisted sideways, pulling the gangplank from beneath Margaret's feet. She fell into the river. Cold water closed over her head. Her bound skirts dragged her downward, while the current carried her beneath the barge. Above her, the engine blades churned the water into a violent white cloud. Margaret clawed at her gown, unable to free her legs. A dark shape descended beside her. Edmund caught her beneath the arms and pulled her away from the blades. They surfaced near the bridge, both gasping. "Hold the stone," he ordered. Margaret gripped the foundation while he tore the heavy outer skirt from her waist. On shore, Crow's men were pursuing Thomas and Samuel toward the warehouse. "Save them," Margaret said. "I am not leaving you. You already did when you signed those papers. Do not make the same choice again." The words struck him harder than the river's current. Edmund helped her onto a narrow ledge, then climbed toward the bank. Margaret followed without waiting for his permission. Inside the warehouse, Samuel had collapsed beside a row of dye vats. Thomas stood over him with a length of wood, facing an armed guard twice his size. Edmund attacked the man from behind. They crashed against a table, scattering instruments across the floor. Margaret reached Thomas and pulled him away as Crow entered through the opposite door. The physician held a burning torch. "If I cannot deliver the research," he said, "no one will possess it." He threw the torch onto a trail of spilled chemical powder. Flame raced across the floor toward the stacked crates. Margaret smelled the mixture and understood immediately. The black compound was not merely poisonous. It was violently unstable near heat. "Everyone out," she screamed. Edmund dragged the unconscious Samuel toward the doorway. Margaret pushed Thomas ahead of her, but a muffled pounding stopped her. It came from beneath the floor. She found an iron hatch hidden under a canvas sheet. Through its small grate, several frightened faces looked up at her. There were more prisoners below. The fire reached the first crate, and the wood began to hiss. Edmund shouted her name from the doorway. Margaret seized the hatch handle, but it was secured by a heavy lock. In the smoke behind her, Caroline appeared holding the only key. "If you want them to live," she said, "you will let my brother burn." "Give me the key," Margaret said. Caroline stood beyond the advancing flames, her ivory cloak stained with soot. "Order Edmund back inside. Crow has a boat waiting for me. Once my brother is dead, you may free the prisoners." "You expect me to trust you?" "I expect you to choose between strangers and your husband." Edmund moved toward Caroline, but part of the ceiling collapsed between them. Sparks filled the warehouse. "Margaret, get out," he shouted. She looked through the hatch grate. At least 8 prisoners were trapped below, some too weak to stand. She could not abandon them, but sacrificing Edmund would not guarantee their release. The fire climbed the nearest chemical crate. Margaret grabbed an iron rod and struck the lock. It barely dented. Caroline edged toward a side door. Margaret hurled the rod at the pulley above her. The loose chain dropped, tangling around Caroline's shoulders and knocking her down. The key slid across the floor. Margaret seized it and unlocked the hatch. A wave of chemical fumes rose from below. She descended into the cellar, where 8 more patients were chained along the wall. One conscious woman pointed toward a desk. The guard keeps the shackles key there. Margaret opened the drawer and found the key beside a leather ledger. She slipped the book beneath her apron, then released the prisoners. Above them, Edmund forced his way through the burning debris. The roof will not hold. Together, they guided the patients into the drainage tunnel. Margaret sent Thomas ahead, followed by those able to crawl. Edmund carried an unconscious woman, while Samuel helped a trembling miner. The first explosion shook the cellar. Brick dust rained down. A support beam split, trapping Margaret behind the others. Edmund turned back. "Keep moving," she ordered. He ignored her and lifted the burning beam long enough for her to crawl beneath it. Flames scorched his sleeve and blistered his hand, but he did not release the timber until she was clear. They emerged on the riverbank seconds before the warehouse roof collapsed. Across the water, Crow's barge was moving downstream. Caroline was aboard. "She escaped," Edmund said. "She left something behind." Margaret opened the ledger. Its pages recorded patient numbers, dosages, physical reactions, and payments. Beside several entries appeared the initials CV and AC. Crow had documented his crimes with extraordinary precision. Then Margaret reached the final pages. They contained names of military officers, investors, and 3 hospital governors. Each had paid for information about Crow's compound, a drug intended to keep wounded soldiers moving despite exhaustion and pain. At the bottom of one page appeared Edmund's signature. He stared at it. "I never signed this ledger, but you signed the authorization Crow used to make everything else appear lawful. I believed Caroline was arranging a government supply contract. You believed what benefited you." He lowered his eyes. Yes, it was the first admission he had made without excuse. Hooves thundered along the parish road. Magistrate Harcourt arrived with 6 constables, summoned by Thomas before Edmund intercepted him. Margaret handed Harcourt the ledger and led him to the rescued patients. Samuel Pike testified that Crow had injected him against his will. Nurse Bell's name was missing from those gathered. Before Margaret could ask about her, one constable emerged from the ruined hospital carrying a sealed envelope. "We found this in the Duchess's chamber," he said. "It contains passage papers to France and a confession in her handwriting." Margaret opened it. The letter declared that she had poisoned Samuel Pike, burned her laboratory, and fled England out of guilt. The imitation of her writing was nearly perfect. Harcourt's expression hardened. "Until this document is examined, Your Grace, I must place you under arrest." Edmund stepped between them. "My wife just saved 16 people, and evidence says she may have helped imprison them first." Margaret looked again at the forged confession. A faint violet stain marked its lower corner, the same specialized ink she had seen on Nurse Bell's fingers. The frightened young nurse had not come to save her. She had entered Margaret's room to steal the medicine bottle and plant the letter. Before Margaret could explain, a constable fastened iron cuffs around her wrists. From the river came the distant blast of a ship's horn. Crow and Caroline had reached the coastal vessel, and they were taking the only witness who could prove who forged Margaret's confession. The constables took Margaret to the Blackmere Parish jail rather than the manor. Edmund followed on horseback, but Magistrate Harcourt refused to release her into his custody. "You signed the authorization that placed Crow inside the hospital," Harcourt told him. "Until I determine your involvement, Your Grace, you are a witness, not her protector." Margaret welcomed the decision. Edmund had already confused protection with control too many times. Inside the cell, Harcourt placed the forged confession on a table between them. "Can you prove this is not your handwriting? The letters are copied well, but the ink was mixed recently. It contains violet aniline. That proves nothing. It proves who prepared it." Margaret explained, that Nurse Bell suffered from a skin condition. Weeks earlier, Margaret had created a protective salve for her and warned that aniline dye would stain the damaged skin for days. When the nurse arrived at the manor, violet marks covered her fingers. Harcourt remained cautious. The nurse is gone, but her room is not. Search it for practice sheets, ink, or correspondence from Caroline. Edmund stepped toward the cell. I will search it. No, Margaret said. He stopped. You had my laboratory sealed before examining a single bottle. You signed documents without reading them, then ordered me home when I presented evidence. Anything you find alone will be challenged as the act of a husband protecting his name. She turned to Harcourt. Send 2 constables and 1 hospital governor who was not named in Crow's ledger. Harcourt nodded and issued the order. Edmund looked at Margaret through the bars. His burned hand had begun to blister, but she felt no impulse to tend it. What can I do? He asked. Tell the truth publicly. If I reveal that I authorized Crow's research, Blackmere may be stripped of its government contracts. That is a consequence, not an excuse. His face tightened, yet this time he did not argue. By afternoon, the search party returned with a locked writing case found beneath Nurse Bell's bed. Inside were pages filled with attempts to imitate Margaret's signature. There were also 3 letters from Caroline promising the nurse enough money to take her younger brothers away from the workhouse. The forged confession collapsed as evidence. Harcourt removed Margaret's cuffs. Crow's coastal ship is expected to leave at high tide tonight, he said. The harbor master will not stop it without an official warrant, and the district judge is attending a military reception 20 miles away. Edmund took the incriminating ledger. Then I will bring it to him. Harcourt blocked the door. If the names inside are genuine, some of the men at that reception financed Crow. Margaret examined the ledger again. The dosing records were detailed, but the payment pages could be dismissed as Crow's private invention. They needed physical evidence connecting Caroline to the prisoners and the investors to the compound. Then she noticed several page numbers missing from the sequence. Crow removed the original payment receipts, she said. He would keep them close in case his patrons betrayed him. On the ship? Edmund asked. Or aboard the barge? The damaged barge had run aground 2 miles downstream after the warehouse explosion. Margaret insisted on joining the search. At dusk, they reached the vessel under guard. Broken bottles and wet documents covered its deck. In Crow's cabin, Edmund found a hidden compartment beneath the desk, but it contained only an empty envelope. Margaret searched the medical cabinet. One drawer smelled faintly of violet dye. Inside lay Nurse Bell's missing hospital cap. A spot of fresh blood stained its edge. She was here, Margaret said. Crow discovered she kept the practice sheets. A weak knock sounded beneath the cabin floor. They lifted a trapdoor and found Nurse Bell curled inside the storage hold, bruised but alive. She clutched a wax-sealed packet against her chest. I took these before they locked me in, she whispered. The packet contained Crow's original receipts, signed by Caroline and several military investors. It also held a passenger list for the coastal vessel. 6 surviving patients were still aboard, scheduled to sail before midnight. Nurse Bell began to weep. I forged the confession because Lady Caroline threatened my brothers. But I heard Dr. Crow say he would kill the Duchess even if she was convicted. I tried to recover the letter. Margaret did not absolve her. You will testify to everything. Yes, Your Grace. A constable hurried onto the barge carrying news from the harbor. The coastal ship had moved its departure forward. It would sail within the hour. Edmund ordered the horses prepared, but Harcourt caught his arm. There is another problem. The district judge has already issued an arrest warrant based on a message from Lady Caroline. For whom? Margaret asked. Harcourt looked at Edmund. For the Duke of Blackmere, on charges of directing the entire operation. Soldiers appeared along the riverbank before they could move. Their commander unfolded the warrant. Edmund quietly handed Margaret Crow's ledger and raised his uninjured hand. "Go to the harbor," he told her. "This time, I will bear the cost of my own signature." As the soldiers took him away, Margaret saw smoke rising beyond the distant harbor. Crow's ship had begun burning its evidence, with 6 patients still locked below deck. Margaret reached the harbor with Harcourt and 4 constables as flames climbed the coastal ship's stern. Sailors crowded the quay, but no one approached the vessel. Black smoke poured from its lower deck, carrying the same metallic odor as Crow's compound. "The patients are below the waterline," Margaret said. "If the chemical crates ignite, the entire hull may explode." The harbor master blocked the gangway. "No one boards until the fire crew arrives. 6 people will suffocate before then. They are already listed as dead." Margaret thrust Crow's ledger against his chest. "They have names, families, and heartbeats. Move." She crossed the gangway before he could stop her. Harcourt followed with 2 constables. Inside, smoke obscured the corridor. Margaret wrapped a wet scarf across her mouth and followed the sound of pounding beneath the deck. The stairwell was locked. Harcourt fired at the latch, but the bullet only scarred the iron. Margaret found a narrow pipe running along the wall. It fed seawater to the deck pump. She struck its valve with a wrench until water sprayed across the heated lock. The sudden cooling cracked the metal enough for a constable to break it. Below, 6 patients lay chained inside a cargo hold. One had stopped breathing. Margaret knelt beside him while Harcourt opened the shackles. His pulse was faint, his lips dark from smoke. She cleared his airway and forced air into his lungs until he coughed. The deck shook. "Out!" Harcourt shouted. They carried the patients toward the gangway. Margaret remained with the last woman, whose legs would not support her. As they reached the upper deck, Crow stepped from behind the mainmast. He held a pistol in one hand and a torch in the other. Caroline stood beside him, her wrists tied. "My sister-in-law has become inconvenient," she said. "He intends to blame both of us." Crow pressed the pistol against Caroline's neck. "Put down the ledger, Duchess." Margaret held it over the railing. "If you shoot either of us, I drop this into the harbor. Without your records, your investors will claim you acted alone. They will protect me." They already issued a warrant against Edmund using Caroline's testimony. "You are the last liability." Fear flickered across Crow's face. Caroline saw it too. She drove her elbow into his ribs. The pistol fired into the mast, and Margaret threw herself forward. Crow lost the torch, but it landed beside a leaking chemical crate. Fire flashed across the deck. Harcourt tackled Crow while Margaret dragged Caroline toward the gangway. A second explosion tore through the stern, throwing them onto the quay. The ship began listing. Sailors pulled the remaining patients to safety as the mast collapsed into the water. Crow was brought ashore in chains, coughing blood but alive. Caroline attempted to step into a waiting carriage. Margaret caught her arm. "You are not leaving. I helped you stop him. You helped create him." Caroline's expression hardened. "If I testify, half the War Office will fall. They will never permit a trial. Then we will make the evidence public before they can bury it." Nurse Bell arrived under guard with the signed receipts. When she identified Caroline as the woman who ordered the forged confession, Harcourt placed the Duke's sister under arrest. Before being taken away, Caroline leaned toward Margaret. "You think Edmund chose you tonight? He chose survival. His title, his lands, and his freedom depend on your testimony now." Margaret watched her go. The accusation did not change the facts. Edmund had saved her at the dye works, but only after his betrayal had placed every life in danger. At dawn, Margaret entered the coastal courthouse carrying the ledger, the receipts, and samples of Crow's compound. The rescued patients filled the public gallery. The district judge arrived with 3 military officers whose initials appeared in Crow's accounts. Edmund was brought in under guard. He looked exhausted, but when the judge offered to release him in exchange for declaring Margaret solely responsible for the hospital research, he did not hesitate. "My wife warned me," Edmund said. "I silenced her because the truth threatened my ambition. Every authorization bears my signature. I will not purchase my freedom with another lie about her." A murmur swept through the courtroom. The judge ordered the doors closed. "No one leaves," he said. "This hearing now concerns treason." Soldiers moved toward Margaret's evidence table. Harcourt reached for his pistol, but Margaret stopped him. Violence would only allow the officers to claim the records had been seized for public safety. Instead, she lifted Crow's ledger high enough for the gallery to see. "You may lock these doors," she said, "but 3 copies of every page are already traveling to London." It was a bluff. Then a voice called from the rear gallery. "No, Your Grace, they have already arrived." A royal messenger stepped forward and displayed the king's seal. "The Crown has ordered an open inquiry at Blackmere," he announced, "and the first witness will be the Duchess herself." Beside the judge, one military officer quietly drew a pistol and aimed it at Margaret beneath the table. Margaret saw the pistol reflected in the polished water pitcher. The military officer's finger tightened around the trigger beneath the table. She dropped Crow's ledger. The shot passed over her and shattered the courtroom window. Harcourt overturned the evidence table, while the royal messenger's guards seized the officer before he could fire again. The ledger landed open at Edmund's feet. He picked it up carefully and handed it to the messenger. "Colonel Ashford," the messenger said, looking at the restrained officer, "your attempt to murder a witness will be entered into the record." Ashford struggled against the guards. "That woman stole military property." Margaret rose. "You called the patient's property as well." The judge could no longer close the inquiry without appearing complicit. Under royal order, the doors were reopened and townspeople crowded the corridor as Margaret took the witness chair. She described Samuel Pike's unexplained death, the altered medicine, the missing patients, and the underground ward. She presented the black compound and explained how Crow had combined stimulants with antimony, creating temporary endurance followed by tremors, organ failure, and death. Samuel then entered the courtroom alive. Several governors recoiled. Their accusation against Margaret had depended upon his corpse. Crow was brought in under guard. When confronted with his own dosage records, he blamed Caroline. She provided the hospital and selected patients unlikely to be missed. Caroline's composure finally broke. "You designed the compound, and your brother signed the authorization." Every gaze turned toward Edmund. He stepped into the witness box without being summoned. "I signed it," he said. "My sister promised me a government appointment and relief from the hospital's expenses. Margaret demanded an inquiry, but I valued my advancement more than her judgment. When she showed me evidence, I silenced her to avoid scandal." Margaret listened without softening. His confession was necessary, but it could not restore those who had died. Edmund continued, "I removed my wife from the institution she built, delivered her work to people I had not investigated, and allowed my name to make their crimes appear lawful. No deception by my sister excuses those decisions. Caroline stared at him as though he had struck her. The royal messenger ordered Crow's receipts read aloud. Each payment matched an entry in Caroline's private account. Nurse Bell then admitted forging Margaret's confession under threat and identified Caroline's instructions. The evidence cleared Margaret of murder and arson. But Harcourt had one final question. Where is the original bottle taken from Samuel Pike's bedside? Nurse Bell lowered her eyes. Dr. Crow took it from me. He said it would be destroyed. Crow smiled faintly. Without the bottle, the prosecution could prove illegal experimentation, but not conclusively connect Samuel's poisoning to him. Margaret remembered the fire, the carriage, and the medicine odor in Crow's cabin. Then she recalled how his silver-tipped cane had never left his hand, not even when he arrived in his nightshirt. "Bring me Dr. Crow's cane," she said. A guard placed it on the evidence table. Margaret unscrewed the silver handle. Hidden inside was a narrow glass chamber containing the missing brown bottle and several folded formulas. Crow surged from his seat, but the guards forced him down. The bottle still bore Samuel's name, Margaret's seal, and Crow's fingerprints in dried black residue. The judge formally dismissed every charge against Margaret. He ordered Crow, Caroline, Colonel Ashford, and 3 hospital governors held for trial. Edmund's warrant was not withdrawn. His Grace knowingly authorized restricted research without lawful oversight, the messenger announced. Whether he understood its purpose will affect his sentence, not erase his responsibility. Edmund bowed his head. "I understand." As guards approached him, Caroline began laughing. "You have proved only the first half," she told Margaret. "Crow did not choose St. Agatha's because it was convenient. He chose it because of you." Margaret went still. Caroline pointed toward the formulas hidden in the cane. "Your husband did not merely give Crow a hospital. He gave him access to your private medical notebooks months before dismissing you." Margaret turned to Edmund. The horror on his face answered before he spoke. Crow's compound had been built from her own research, and Edmund had secretly surrendered it long before Samuel Pike was poisoned. Edmund did not deny it. 3 months ago, Caroline asked for your research on battlefield fever, he said. She claimed a government committee wished to evaluate it. You entered my locked study? I gave her the key. Margaret felt the betrayal more deeply than his public accusation. Her notebooks contained 20 years of work inherited from her father and refined through thousands of hours beside sickbeds. Edmund had treated them as household property he could trade for influence. Did you read what you surrendered? No. That has been your answer to every crime. The royal messenger examined Crow's hidden formulas. Several passages had been copied directly from Margaret's work, but the dosages had been altered to force the body past exhaustion. Crow had converted a treatment intended to stabilize fever patients into a weapon. Margaret faced the court. My original notebooks can prove which parts were stolen and how Crow changed them. They were destroyed in the laboratory fire, Caroline said. No, I never kept the originals at St. Agatha's. Caroline's confidence vanished. Margaret had stored them inside her father's old apothecary chest at Blackmere Manor. The Crown ordered the chest brought to the open inquiry scheduled for the following morning. Edmund was taken back into custody. Before leaving, he stopped beside Margaret. I will restore the hospital and everything I took from you. You cannot restore trust as though it were a building, I know. You knew I would never willingly surrender those notebooks. That is why you stole them. His silence acknowledged the truth. Margaret continued, Whatever the court decides, I will no longer live under your authority. St. Agatha's must be transferred into an independent trust, controlled by its physicians and patients, not by you, Caroline, or any future duke. I will sign it. You will do so because it is right, not because you expect forgiveness. Yes, for the first time, he asked for nothing in return. That evening, Margaret returned to Blackmere under royal guard. The fire had left the hospital's rear wing roofless, but the main wards remained standing. Rescued patients filled every bed. Thomas met her in the corridor, carrying a package wrapped in scorched cloth. Mr. Pike found it inside the old chapel wall. It contained 3 pages torn from Crow's ledger. Each listed patients who had died during earlier trials. Beside their numbers appeared instructions to falsify burial records and pay their families from a private Blackmere account. The account belonged to Edmund. Margaret studied the dates. The payments had begun before he claimed to know anything about Crow's research. When Edmund was brought to the hospital to sign the trust papers, she placed the pages before him. "Explain this." He read them twice. "I authorized charitable payments to bereaved families. Caroline told me the hospital lacked funds. She used your account to silence them, and I never asked why." Margaret turned to the final page. At the bottom was a recent order, written in Caroline's hand. "Transfer the original notebooks before the inquiry. Burn the apothecary chest after copying the final formula." Margaret ran toward the manor. The study door stood open. Her father's chest was gone. A servant reported that a royal carriage had collected it an hour earlier. The driver had shown the king's seal. The messenger beside Margaret examined the authorization and shook his head. "The seal is genuine," he said, "but I issued no order." From the courtyard came the sound of departing wheels. Caroline had one accomplice who had not yet been exposed, someone inside the royal household. And that person now possessed Margaret's original research, the last proof of her innocence, and a formula capable of killing an army. The carriage tracks led toward the military reception hall, where the royal inquiry had been ordered to reconvene. Margaret arrived with Harcourt, the royal messenger, and 2 mounted guards. Inside the crowded chamber, Colonel Ashford's secretary stood beside Caroline's remaining investors. At his feet rested Margaret's apothecary chest. The man introduced himself as Lord Vincent Hale, Deputy Keeper of Royal Seals. He held up one of her notebooks. "These formulas are Crown property. The Duchess of Blackmere developed them inside a hospital financed by her husband's estate." "The hospital was founded with my inheritance," Margaret replied. "My earliest notes predate my marriage by 11 years." She produced her father's letters, each referring to the treatments they had developed together. Their dates and faded seals proved that Crow had copied her work, not created it. Hale reached for the final formula. Margaret stopped him. "Read the last line aloud." He hesitated. There was no final line. Years earlier, Margaret had separated every important formula into 2 volumes. The chest contained ingredients, but not the method that made them safe. The missing calculations remained in a small notebook she always carried inside her apron. Crow's compound had failed because he never understood that second process. "You murdered patients for an incomplete formula," Margaret said. "Then you tried to steal the only evidence proving why." Hale attempted to burn the notebook, but the royal guards seized him. The chest and its contents were entered publicly into evidence. The following trials lasted 6 weeks. Crow was convicted of murder, kidnapping, unlawful experimentation, and attempted destruction of evidence. He received a life sentence in a prison hospital under permanent supervision. Caroline was convicted of conspiracy, fraud, kidnapping, and falsifying death records. Her property was sold to compensate the victims' families, and she was sentenced to transportation. Colonel Ashford and Lord Hale were stripped of rank and imprisoned. The three corrupt hospital governors lost their offices and fortunes. Nurse Bell received a reduced sentence for testifying, but Margaret required her to admit every forged document before the families she had harmed. Edmund was not declared innocent. The court found that he had not known the full purpose of the experiments, but his signatures, theft of Margaret's notebooks, and willful refusal to investigate had enabled them. He lost his government contracts, resigned every public appointment, and paid substantial compensation from the Blackmere estate. At Margaret's request, St. Agatha's became an independent charitable trust. Its board included physicians, nurses, former patients, and representatives elected by the surrounding villages. No duke could ever control it again. On the day the hospital reopened, Edmund stood before its governors and the families of those who had died. "My wife did not fail this institution," he said. "I failed her. I accused her without evidence, stole her work, silenced her warnings, and handed authority to people whose promises served my ambition. The crimes were theirs, but the door they entered through was opened by me." He then returned Margaret's inheritance, transferred ownership of her research entirely to her, and signed a deed granting her financial independence. When they were alone, he placed the hospital keys in her hand. "I do not ask you to forgive me," he said. "I only ask permission to continue paying what I owe. You do not need my permission to do what is right. Will you return to Blackmere?" Margaret closed her fingers around the keys. "No." The answer wounded him, but he accepted it without argument. Margaret moved into the restored physician's house beside St. Agatha's. She petitioned for a formal separation and devoted the next year to treating Crow's surviving victims. Edmund funded their care anonymously and never entered the hospital without an invitation. He wrote to her only once each month. His letters contained no pleas, only reports of restitution, reforms, and the families he had compensated. Margaret did not promise reconciliation. Regret could begin a man's reform, but it did not obligate the woman he had harmed to reward it. 1 year after the fire, Samuel Pike stood beside her as a new brass plaque was fixed above the hospital entrance. St. Agatha's Hospital, founded and directed by Margaret Vane. In the opening ward, Thomas Reed helped distribute medicine, while Nurse Bell's younger brothers attended the hospital school, supported by a fund created for workhouse children. Edmund watched from beyond the gates. He removed his hat when Margaret appeared, but did not approach. She acknowledged him with a small nod, then turned back to her patients. The first time he had taken her keys, 12 governors had watched in silence. Now Margaret unlocked the hospital doors herself and handed a second set to the nurses.